I saw a strange man approach my wife's lips at the company dinner. The moment I saw the way she looked at him, something inside me just broke. Her laugh, the way she tilted her head slightly, her eyes shining as if she were facing something irresistible. All of this was mine. It always was. And now, right there, in front of everyone, she offered it to someone else. My body moved before my mind even processed it. My hands were shaking, my heart was beating in my chest as if trying to escape the reality that was unfolding before my eyes. Betrayal never comes with a warning. It doesn't send clear signals, it doesn't allow us to prepare. It just happens, and when we realize it, we're already at rock bottom. But in that moment, in that split second when I saw her giving herself to another, I realized that there had never been enough preparation for this. I walked over to them and the voice came out before I could control it. Loud, trembling, filled with a hatred that I had never felt until then. What is this I'm seeing? Are you going crazy? You ruined our entire marriage. I want a divorce now. The hall fell silent. The waiter, who was carrying a tray with wine glasses, stopped halfway. The company's colleagues froze with the cutlery in their hands. I could feel the stares, the held breaths, the tension in the air. But none of that mattered. Her eyes looked at me, wide. A second ago they were filled with desire for the other man. Now, they were filled with panic. She tried to say something, but I raised my hand, telling her to shut up. There was nothing more she could say that wasn't a lie. The man beside her, a stranger to me until that moment, stepped back. He tried to move away, but I had already committed him to my memory. I knew who he was now. And there was no escape. I felt her hands on my arm, shaking. Please, we can talk, it's not what you think. I laughed. I laughed loudly, bitterly, loaded with all the venom that was burning inside. That's not what I'm thinking. I'm looking at it with my own eyes. What do you want me to believe? That this is an accident? That he tripped and fell into your mouth? She shook her head, tears began to form, and I saw the lie being constructed in real time. Every word that would come out of her mouth would be an insult to my intelligence. I didn't stay there to listen. I turned my back and left. People murmured around. Some tried to hide their shame, others simply observed the spectacle. But the worst was yet to come. Hours later, my phone started vibrating non-stop. Messages, links, notifications from all social networks. Something was happening. When I finally opened one of the messages, I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. Someone recorded everything. Every detail. My fury. Her look of despair. The absolute silence of the restaurant. And now, it was on the internet. It went viral. The comments were a mix of shock, mockery and judgment. Look at her face when he screams, she looks like a cornered rat, said one. Man of respect. Put your foot down, there are better things out there, wrote another. But the worst thing was the memes. I was everywhere. My face distorted by hate, frozen forever on the internet. And the most ironic? The story didn't end there. Because, contrary to what I imagined, this was just the beginning. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support cheating in no way. The stories you will hear are fictitious, but they carry an undeniable truth. Betrayal destroys lives, families, and trusts that can never be recovered. Each narrative is a deep dive into the consequences of disloyalty, showing that every action has a price, and, often, it is too high to be paid. Now, get ready. The story you're about to hear is intense, dramatic and shocking. Are you ready? Then let's start. The restaurant's ballroom was impeccably decorated for the company's annual event. The golden lights created a welcoming atmosphere, the flower arrangements finely arranged on the tables gave a sophisticated touch to the evening, and the murmur of conversations mixed with the soft sound of ambient music. It was an important event, where executives and employees gathered to celebrate the year's successes, exchange contacts and strengthen professional relationships. For many, it was a night of prestige, of showing their presence, of highlighting their position within the corporation. For others, it was just a social obligation. For Daniel, it was an opportunity to show the world how proud he was of his wife, Laura. Married for 8 years, they had built a relationship that, in everyone's eyes, was exemplary. He was a dedicated and meticulous professional, a man who was proud of the life he had built. He started from scratch, facing difficulties, working hard to gain respect in the sector and, most importantly, ensuring a comfortable life for his family. Laura, with a vibrant and captivating personality, had a natural charisma that made everyone like her. Always confident, elegant and attentive, she knew how to lead a conversation, how to make people feel at ease. She worked in the same sector as her husband, but in a competing company. This was never a problem for them, on the contrary, they always shared challenges and strategies without competition disturbing the harmony between the two. That night, Laura wore an elegantly cut black dress that highlighted her curves, her brown hair fell over her shoulders in soft waves, and her eyes sparkled under the salon's lighting. Daniel watched her in awe as she chatted animatedly with a group of colleagues. Her smile was his anchor. It was proof that, despite the difficulties, the stressful moments of everyday life, there was still love, there was still complicity. They arrived at the event together, as they always did. Along the way, they talked about planning an end-of-year vacation, something they were both looking forward to. It had been a while since they had a moment just for the two of them, without meetings, without pressure, without the routine that so often kept them apart. The idea of spending a few days in a quiet place, away from the hustle and bustle, was something they both agreed they needed. As the night progressed, Daniel was greeted by some superiors and colleagues, which momentarily took him away from Laura. He watched her from afar, between conversations and toasts, appreciating the way she carried herself. I felt proud to be by her side. She always knew how to stand out without needing exaggeration, without needing to be the center of attention. Just being who you were, and that was enough to captivate anyone. At one point, when he returned to his wife's side, she was laughing at something one of his colleagues had said. Her laugh was authentic, spontaneous, and Daniel smiled along with it, feeling lucky. He took a glass of wine from the tray of a passing waiter and raised it in a toast. Laura followed the gesture, and the two touched glasses gently. "Tonight," she said with a twinkle in her eye. "To us," he replied, bringing the wine to his lips. Laura kept her gaze fixed on his for a few seconds before looking away. That wasn't unusual, but something about the way she looked away left Daniel with a brief sense of unease. Maybe it was just tiredness, maybe she was overwhelmed with work. He didn't pay much attention to it and soon became involved in the conversation going on around him. Dinner continued with exquisite dishes, toasts, speeches and laughter. Daniel enjoyed these occasions, despite not always having patience for the formality that accompanied them. It was a moment when he could feel part of something bigger, where recognition for hard work was present. Laura, on the other hand, seemed to be enjoying it more than he was. Her laughter echoed throughout the room, her posture was relaxed, and she moved from side to side, greeting colleagues and acquaintances. Daniel saw her in different parts of the restaurant, interacting with people he knew and others he had never seen before. He allowed himself a moment of contemplation, observing how the woman he loved always managed to light up any room she was in. Still, at some point during the night, the restless feeling returned. Something indefinable. He couldn't say what it was. An intuition, perhaps. The kind of thing that can't be explained, just felt. But he pushed the thought away, convincing himself that it was just a reflection of his own tiredness. When Laura returned to the table and ran her fingers lightly over his hand, he took a deep breath and smiled. He felt her touch, warm and familiar, and he wondered why on earth he had felt that pang of insecurity. That was foolish. They were fine. They always have been. The room was now more lively, people had already drunk enough for the formalities to dissolve and the conversations to become lighter. Couples danced in the center of the space reserved for this, executives discussed their upcoming projects while toasting, and the night was heading towards a pleasant conclusion. Laura excused herself to go to the bathroom and walked away. Daniel remained at the table, engaged in a conversation about investments with some colleagues, but his gaze occasionally wandered around the room. That's when he saw her. She wasn't in the bathroom. She was in the corner of the room, near the bar, talking to a man he didn't recognize. There was nothing strange about that, of course. She was always a sociable person. But the way he slightly leaned his body forward, the way he smiled, the way he lightly touched his own collar as he spoke. There was something different there. Daniel frowned, watching the interaction for a few seconds. Maybe it was just his mind playing tricks, maybe the drink was influencing his judgment. But something inside him refused to ignore that scene. He looked away and tried to focus on the conversation around him. Maybe it was just a wrong impression, maybe I was seeing things where there was nothing. But that feeling of restlessness, which he tried so hard to ignore, now seemed impossible to shake. The room was livelier than before, laughter echoed throughout the room, conversations flowed more freely now that the formalities were behind them. Daniel still held a glass of wine in his hand, but his mind was no longer on the conversation going on around him. His eyes returned to the corner of the room, where Laura was still talking to that man. He tried to ignore it, tried to push away the uneasiness that was growing inside him, but something about that interaction bothered him in a way he couldn't explain. The way Laura smiled, the way she slightly leaned her body forward, the way she played with her hair in an absent-minded way. Small details, almost imperceptible, but which seemed to him to carry a much greater weight. He took a deep breath, trying to convince himself that he was exaggerating. Laura was always nice to everyone, that didn't mean anything. Maybe it was just a coworker she ran into and decided to chat for a few minutes. Nothing beyond that. But then, he noticed the way the man lightly touched her arm as he said something. A subtle, almost natural gesture, but it made something inside Daniel twist. He looked away and tried to focus on the conversation taking place at the table. Someone was talking about a promising new investment, but the words seemed distant, drowned out by the noise their own mind was making. His breathing was slow, controlled, but there was a tension in his chest that he couldn't ignore. Laura returned to the table a few minutes later, smiling as if nothing had happened. She sat down next to him and ran her fingers gently over his hand, a gesture that always used to calm him. But this time, her touch didn't have the same effect. He felt the warmth of her skin, but he also felt something different. A discomfort that I couldn't explain. He wanted to ask who the man she was talking to was. He wanted to know what they were talking about, he wanted to understand what it was about that moment that made him feel so strange. But he remained silent. The night continued with more conversations, more toasts, more interactions. But for him, something had changed. At one point, when Laura got up to talk to some friends, he noticed that the man from before was also moving away from the table where he was. He followed him with his gaze, trying to understand where he was going. When he realized, Laura and the man were on the other side of the room, close to the outside area, where the lighting was lower. His heart sped up. He didn't want to seem paranoid, he didn't want to be the kind of man who doubts his wife for no reason. But that discomfort inside him only grew. He tried to convince himself that it was just a coincidence. Maybe they were acquaintances, maybe they were just talking about something trivial. But his intuition said something else. He decided not to ignore it. He got up calmly, without rushing, without attracting attention. He took a glass of whiskey from a passing waiter and headed outside. The cool night air hit his face as he walked through the door. He walked slowly, pretending to just enjoy the environment, but his eyes were fixed on a specific point. And then, he saw them. Laura and the man were too close. Her hands rested on his shoulders as she laughed at something he said. Her eyes sparkled in a way Daniel hadn't seen in a long time. The proximity between the two was intimate, comfortable, as if it wasn't the first time they had seen each other like that. Daniel felt his chest tighten. It couldn't be happening. He wanted to get closer, wanted to stop it, but his body didn't move. He just watched, as if he needed to be sure of what his eyes were seeing. That's when it happened. The man bowed slightly. Laura did not step back. On the contrary, she closed her eyes for a brief second before allowing their lips to meet. Daniel felt the world fall apart. The blood pounded in his ears, his breath caught in his throat. Time seemed to slow down. Every detail was recorded in his mind. The touch of their hands, the way their bodies got closer, the way she gave herself to the kiss without hesitation. He felt a biting cold cross his chest. The pain was immediate, as if something inside him had been ripped apart all at once. The trust, the love, the years of history together, everything seemed to fall apart right there, at that exact moment. His fists were clenched, his entire body was shaking. He could have turned his back and walked away, he could have walked away and pretended he never saw it. But he couldn't. His heart was on fire. And that flame was about to explode. Daniel felt his chest burn as he walked towards them. His entire body was shaking, and it wasn't just from anger. It was a mix of disbelief, betrayal, and an emptiness he had never felt before. Every step was heavy, every second seemed longer than it should have been. The sound of your own heartbeat drowned out everything around you. He didn't see anyone else, he didn't hear anything other than the scene unfolding in front of him. Laura laughed softly after the kiss, as if nothing much had happened, as if that moment was something trivial. The man in front of him smiled back, as if he was already used to it. Daniel had never seen him before, but now his face was burned into his mind like a scar. What scared him most wasn't the kiss itself, but the naturalness with which everything happened. This wasn't a one-night stand. That was familiarity. He didn't hesitate. He got closer and felt the adrenaline course through every inch of his body as the words came out of his mouth without control, filled with hurt, with anger, with everything he could no longer contain. He asked what the hell was going on there, his voice louder than he intended, more desperate than he would have liked. Laura turned around in fright, her eyes wide, her breathing quickened. For a brief moment, he saw guilt on her face, but it was soon replaced by something different. Fear. The man next to her took a step back, raising his hands as if trying to remove himself from the situation. Laura opened her mouth, but no words came out. Daniel waited. He waited for an explanation, for a justification, for anything that might make sense. But all that came was silence. He laughed. Not an amused laugh, but a dry, bitter laugh, filled with disbelief. His chest rose and fell as he tried to maintain control, as he tried to process what he had just seen. He demanded that she say something, that she explain, that she make sense of it, because nothing in his head could justify what was happening. Laura took a deep breath, her eyes shining in the dim light outside. He tried to speak, tried to find the right words, but anything he said at that moment would sound like a lie. Daniel stared at her, waiting, demanding that she say something that could change what he had just seen. But then, before she could utter any sentences, the man next to her broke the silence. He didn't need to say much. One sentence, simple and devastating, was enough for everything to collapse at once. He doesn't know, does he? The question hung in the air like a punch. Daniel blinked, trying to understand what that meant. His eyes went from Laura to the man, then back to Laura. He saw something different in her now. The fear became more evident, the hesitation greater. Something was wrong, far beyond betrayal, far beyond that moment. Laura shook her head, as if to stop any more words from being said, but it was too late. Daniel took another step closer, demanding that they speak at once. The anger inside him mixed with confusion, with pain, with something he couldn't name. The man sighed, as if he was tired of the situation, as if he just wanted to get it over with. And then, he said, "I'm her brother." The words hit Daniel like an overwhelming wave. He felt the air escape from his lungs, felt his legs go weak, as if the reality around him was falling apart. He didn't understand. It couldn't be. He looked at Laura, waiting for her to deny it, waiting for her to say that this was nonsense. But all he saw was her face contorting, her eyes full of tears ready to fall. She didn't deny it. Daniel took a step back, feeling as if the ground was giving way beneath his feet. His entire body was shaking, his mind was spinning in 1,000 directions at once, trying to fit together the pieces of a puzzle that didn't make sense. He shook his head, laughed again, but this time there was nothing but pure desperation in that sound. Laura finally broke the silence. His voice was low, hesitant, as if he were afraid to say it out loud. I never told you because I didn't know myself. Until recently. Daniel felt the world spin. What do you mean she didn't know? How was all that possible? He faced the man in front of him, who now had his arms crossed, observing everything with a neutral expression, as if he was used to that type of reaction. Laura tried to explain, but the words came out disjointed, confused. She said that, months ago, she received an anonymous letter talking about her biological family. Who always believed that only her parents raised her, who never suspected anything. But the letter brought information she couldn't ignore. Names, details, evidence. She searched for answers. He looked for documents. And he found it. The man in front of her, the one she had just kissed, was her half-brother. They had the same father. A man who lived a second life, who had 2 families at the same time without anyone knowing. Daniel couldn't breathe. The air seemed thin around him. His mind repeated the information, trying to absorb the reality of it all. He asked why she never told him. He asked how she could hide something so big. Laura looked at the floor, unable to look at him. He said he didn't know how. That she was afraid of his reaction. That he was afraid of how it would change everything. But then, amidst the chaos of her words, came the part he most dreaded hearing. She didn't tell him because, before finding out that they were brothers, she and that man had already had an affair. The impact of the revelation was like a punch in the gut. Daniel felt his insides twist, felt the weight of each word crush him inside. It wasn't just betrayal. It was something much worse. She was sleeping with her own brother without knowing it. He stumbled back, as if he needed to get away from it, as if the very air around her was contaminated. His entire body was on fire, but this time it wasn't just anger. It was disgusting. Laura was crying now, her hands shaking, her face contorted in pain, but he couldn't feel sorry. He couldn't feel anything but repulsion, beyond an overwhelming emptiness that consumed him from the inside out. She tried to get closer, tried to touch him, but he backed away so quickly it looked like he had just seen a ghost. He couldn't stay there. Not after all this. Then, without saying anything else, without looking back, he turned and left. Because nothing more could be said after that. Daniel left the restaurant aimlessly, his steps hurried, his chest rising and falling uncontrollably. The night air didn't seem to be enough, his lungs struggled to absorb something his mind still couldn't process. The city around him seemed like a blur of lights and shadows, but none of that mattered. The bitter taste of truth burned his throat, nausea rose from his stomach, and he felt like at any moment he could simply fall apart. He heard his name being called behind him, Laura's voice cutting through the silence of the street. He kept walking, ignoring it, refusing to look back. But her steps quickened, until finally she caught up to him, holding his arm with trembling hands. He turned around abruptly, shaking off her touch as if it were something contaminated. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, the silence was enough for everything to be said without words. But Laura, with tears streaming down her face, insisted. Please listen to me. He laughed, a bitter laugh, loaded with everything that was trapped inside him. To listen? Do you want me to listen? After all that, after hiding a secret like that, after that? His voice was faltering between anger and pain, the words were broken, as if he couldn't even say them without feeling his stomach turn. Laura ran her hands over her face, desperate, trying to find something that could make him stop, make him understand. I never wanted this to happen, never. I didn't know. He took a step back, shaking his head. But you knew now. And yet, he continued. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Because he was right. Because she had no justification, because there was no way to change what was already done. The silence between the two was overwhelming. The cold night wind blew between the buildings, cars passed on the adjacent avenue, but there, at that moment, nothing existed but them and the ruin they had become. Do you think I can just pretend this didn't happen? That I can overcome this? No, she replied in a faint voice, pressing her arms against her body. But I love you. He felt revulsion rise in his throat. Love? Do you think this is love? She swallowed hard, took a step towards him, but Daniel's look was enough to stop her. I was scared. I didn't know how to tell you. I was trying to understand this too. Were you trying to understand? He interrupted, giving an incredulous laugh. You slept with your own brother and were trying to understand. Laura put her hands over her mouth, her eyes full of despair. But Daniel didn't want to hear it anymore. He turned to leave, but before he took more than 2 steps, another voice appeared in the darkness. I know nothing I say will change what happened, but I won't hide from it. It was him. The man Laura kissed, who she touched as if he were someone she loved. The man who, at that moment, Daniel hated more than anything in the world. He stopped, clenched his fists. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. I didn't know if I wanted to scream, punch him or simply run away and erase that moment from my memory. But he turned around. Laura's brother was standing a few meters ahead, his face serious, without a trace of provocation or cynicism. He was a man dealing with the consequences of his own mistake. Daniel crossed his arms, waiting, but not having the patience to hear empty excuses. You don't need to tell me anything. You don't mean anything to me. The man nodded, but did not back down. I wish I had known earlier. Does this change anything? Daniel shot, his gaze cold. The other hesitated, then responded. Change for me. Silence fell between them again. Daniel felt the weight of the moment, but it wasn't a weight he wanted to carry. He looked at Laura one last time, and what he saw was a broken woman, someone who was no longer the person he married. Don't look for me anymore. He turned and started walking. Laura began to cry again, a low, desperate sound that echoed down the street. But Daniel didn't stop. He didn't look back. Because some things simply can't be fixed. The night stretched into deep darkness as Daniel walked without a defined destination. The biting cold of the morning was nothing compared to the ice that took hold of his chest. The city lights flickered around him, but everything seemed distant, muffled by a pain he still didn't know how to name. He felt empty, as if something inside him had been ripped out abruptly and left a hole that couldn't be filled. His footsteps echoed on the wet asphalt, his hands stuck in his jacket pockets, his thoughts spinning in circles without getting anywhere. The anger was still there, throbbing, mixed with disbelief. But there was something stronger growing inside him now. Something he tried to ignore at any cost. A feeling of loss so deep that it suffocated him. He didn't look back. I didn't know if Laura was still there, if the man she called her brother was still standing in the same place or if they had both already left. I didn't want to know. Any thought that took him back to that scene made his stomach turn. The betrayal was painful in itself, but the size of what it meant surpassed anything he could have imagined. He continued walking until he realized that his steps took him close to home. He stopped for a moment, taking a deep breath, trying to decide if he really wanted to enter that place that, now, seemed like a scene from a past that no longer existed. The thought of walking through that door, of smelling the familiar smell, of seeing the photos on the wall as if nothing had changed, made him hesitate. The place he called home had become a bitter memory. But he needed to get some things, he needed to at least have a little control over something tonight. He turned the key in the lock and entered. The silence in the house was almost deafening. Every detail there seemed to mock him, every piece of furniture, every object, every little detail that carried memories of a love that now turned out to be a lie. He walked into the living room, looked around as if he were seeing the space for the first time. Everything so normal, so untouched, as if that night had never happened. As if Laura was still just his wife and nothing more. As if nothing was broken. But it was. He went to the bedroom, opened the closet and took out a suitcase. I didn't know exactly where I would go, or how long I would be gone. I just knew I couldn't stay there any longer. She started putting clothes into her bag without much discretion, without paying attention to what she chose. The automatic movement helped keep him distracted, at least for a few seconds. Halfway through the process, his eyes fell on the ring on his finger. The sight of the little gold ring seemed worse than any blow he might have received that night. He took the ring between his fingers, slowly turned it, feeling the weight of what it represented. A promise, a built life, everything reduced to something so insignificant in the face of the truth. Without thinking much, he took off the ring and placed it on the dresser. He looked at the object for a few seconds before looking away and continuing to throw the clothes into the suitcase. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the thoughts that crept into his mind. Why didn't Laura ever tell? Why did she choose to hide it until the truth exploded like that? He could understand the shock of finding out something like that, he could imagine how much it affected her. But still, there was a choice. She could have told the truth. He could have walked away. I could have prevented everything from turning into this. The suitcase was almost full when he heard the doorbell ring. His entire body seized up. The sound cut through the silence of the house like a sharp blade. He knew who he was. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to decide if he should ignore it. But the doorbell rang again. And again. He took a deep breath and walked to the door. When he opened it, he found Laura on the other side. Her face was pale, her eyes red, her hair disheveled as if she had spent the last few hours crying without stopping. She looked at him for a long moment before speaking, her voice breaking. I knew you would come home. Daniel crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. What do you want? She swallowed hard, hesitated before continuing. I needed to see you. He laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. I think you've seen enough tonight. Her eyes filled with tears again. I know nothing I say will change what happened, but I couldn't let you go like that. Daniel watched her for a moment, fighting the urge to just close the door. You still don't understand, do you? He spoke, his voice low, full of exhaustion. It's not just about betrayal. It's not just about what you did. It's about everything that came before that. About every choice you made to make this happen. She shook her head quickly, desperately. I never wanted to hurt you. But it hurt. Laura pressed her lips together, trying to hold back crying. You don't know how much I hate myself for this. Daniel let out a heavy sigh, feeling frustration rising within him. Do you hate yourself? He repeated, in disbelief. This isn't about you, Laura. It's not about what you feel. It's not about your fault. She shuddered, lowering her gaze. I wanted everything to be different. He clenched his jaw, feeling anger mix with something darker. But it's not. The silence between them prolonged, filled with everything that could never be said again. Laura looked up, and for an instant, he saw the woman he was once in love with. But that woman no longer existed. I'm leaving, he said, his voice firm. I don't want to hear from you anymore. Her eyes filled with panic. Daniel, please. But he didn't want to hear any more. He closed the door, cutting off any possibility of response. He leaned against the cold wood, taking a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision fall upon him. The only thing I was sure of was that I needed to move on. And for the first time that night, I knew I would do it without looking back. Daniel could feel the heavy silence in the room after closing the door. His heart was still beating fast, but it was no longer from shock, but from overwhelming exhaustion. He leaned back against the cold wood, closed his eyes, and tried to absorb the reality of what he had just done. It wasn't just the end of an argument, it wasn't just another marital fight. That closed door represented the definitive closure of a cycle, the cutting of a bond that he never imagined he would have to break. He let out a long sigh and returned to the bedroom, where his suitcase was still open on the bed. He finished putting on the last few pieces of clothing, picked up his laptop and some important documents. It wouldn't take more than necessary. Every detail of that space seemed loaded with memories that now weighed on him like stones. The frame with the wedding photo was still on the nightstand. For a moment, he held the photo in his hands, observing her smile, the sparkle in her eyes, the happiness frozen in time. A time that no longer existed. He left the photo there and closed the suitcase. Before leaving, he took one last look around the room, trying to feel something other than the numbing pain. But there was no more room for nostalgia. He left and didn't look back. The morning was cold when he put his suitcase in the car. The street was empty, the streetlights flickered dimly, as if even the city was tired of the night. He sat in the driver's seat, started the car and, for a moment, just held the steering wheel, breathing deeply. He could drive to a hotel, to a friend's house, to any place where he could simply exist without having to deal with it for a few hours. But his body felt paralyzed. The phone vibrating on the dashboard snapped him out of his daze. He looked at the screen and saw Laura's name. His chest tightened, but he didn't respond. The phone vibrated again. Then, once more. He let it ring until it went to voicemail. A minute later, a message arrived. "Please answer me. I need to talk to you." He locked the screen and threw his cell phone on the passenger seat. I didn't want to hear anything else. There was nothing more to say. He drove for a while without a specific destination, letting the road decide for him. The streets were empty, and he was lost in his own thoughts as the asphalt passed beneath his wheels. After a while, he realized that he was close to the house of an old friend, Lucas. They didn't talk as much as they used to, but he knew that if there was anyone who would welcome him without questions, it would be him. He stopped the car in front of the house, took a deep breath and got out. He rang the doorbell and waited. A few seconds later, the door opened, and Lucas appeared, his eyes half closed with sleep, his hair messy. "Dude, it's almost 3 in the morning," his voice was hoarse. Daniel forced a humorless smile. "I know. I need a place to stay." Lucas watched his friend's face for a few moments before taking a step to the side and opening the door wider. "Come in." Daniel walked in and felt immediate relief. The familiar smell of the house, the typical disorganization of someone who lived alone, everything seemed like a comforting contrast to the chaos he had just left behind. "Want a beer?" Lucas asked as he closed the door. Daniel shook his head. "No, I just need a shower and a couch." Lucas pointed to the hallway. "The bathroom is in the same place as always. If you want, you have a guest room, you don't need to sleep on the sofa." Daniel nodded in thanks and went to the shower. The hot water helped ease the tension in his muscles, but it didn't erase the whirlwind of thoughts. Every time I closed my eyes, the betrayal scene came back with a vengeance. Their touch, their kiss, their devastating secret. None of it made sense, and at the same time, everything was clear now. He left the bathroom, put on clean clothes and lay down in the guest room, looking at the dark ceiling. Fatigue weighed on his body, but sleep seemed impossible. He took out his cell phone and saw more messages from Laura. "I can't sleep without talking to you. Please don't ignore me. I know you hate me, but I just want you to listen to me one last time." He read them all without responding. Lucas appeared at the door, leaned against the doorframe and crossed his arms. "Do you want to talk about it?" Daniel let out a dry laugh. "I don't even know where to start." Lucas shrugged and entered the room, pulling out a chair to sit down. "Then start with the reason I brought you here in the middle of the night." Daniel was silent for a while, until he finally let out his breath and started counting. Every detail. Without saving anything. The betrayal, the secret, the way it all fell apart. Lucas was silent the entire time, listening without interrupting. When Daniel finished, his friend ran a hand over his face, clearly trying to process everything. "Man, this is surreal." Daniel nodded. "I know." Lucas sighed. "What are you going to do now?" He shook his head, staring at the ceiling again. "I have no idea." The silence between them was long, but not uncomfortable. Lucas finally stood up and patted Daniel on the shoulder. "You know you can stay here as long as you want." Daniel nodded gratefully. Lucas left the room, leaving him alone with his thoughts. But no matter how much I tried to push them away, the images came back like a repetitive movie. He knew he needed to move on. He knew he needed to start rebuilding his life. But that night, all he could do was stare at the ceiling and try to understand how something that seemed so solid had turned to dust before his eyes. The days that followed were long and silent. Daniel didn't come home, he didn't answer any more calls from Laura, he didn't open the messages that were piling up in his inbox. He didn't want to hear excuses, he didn't want explanations. Nothing said would change the fact that everything he built, everything he believed in, had crumbled before his eyes. Life continued at a strange pace, as if on autopilot. He asked for a temporary leave of absence from work, not because he was unable to carry out his responsibilities, but because he simply no longer wanted to face that environment, that social circle that included Laura. He knew that sooner or later the scandal would spread, that looks of pity and whispers would arise. And he didn't want to be the man betrayed, the reason for whispers in the hallways. Time passed indefinitely. Days, weeks. Little by little, he began to retrace his steps, to resume small parts of his routine. He started visiting new places, going out for walks aimlessly, occupying his mind with anything other than the memory of what happened. But the void was still there, and he knew it would take time to fill. Laura, on the other hand, was breaking down. He tried every way to contact Daniel, tried to explain, tried to ask for forgiveness, but found only silence. The weight of the truth finally crushed her. The world around her seemed to crumble just as hard as she maintained her lies. It wasn't just about Daniel. The secret he carried now could not be erased. People began to notice his loaded expression, his lack of smiles, his withdrawn posture. At work, everything became more difficult. After the truth about his betrayal began to spread, his position in the company was put at risk. The image she built over the years crumbled with every judgmental look, with every conversation interrupted as soon as she entered the room. It didn't matter if no one knew the complexity of the secret, the betrayal alone was enough for his reputation to become a shadow of what it once was. The relationship with his half-brother became unsustainable. The weight of the truth made any interaction impossible. He walked away, left the city, trying to start over far away, away from the scandal. He had also been hit, but in a different way. For him it was guilt and shame, for Laura it was a hole she couldn't stop falling into. And then came the moment she feared most. Daniel finally responded to one of her messages. It was a short text, without emotion, without any trace of the man she once loved. "We'll sign the divorce papers tomorrow. There's nothing more to be said." Laura felt her chest tighten when she read those words. "I knew he wouldn't go back, I knew he wouldn't be the type of man to forgive a betrayal, much less one like that." But reading that, seeing the end come to fruition in such a cold sentence, was something that made her lose her breath. The next day, they met at the lawyer's office. The meeting was quick, without exchanging long looks, without any attempt at reconciliation. Daniel signed the papers with firm hands, as if that act was his release. Laura hesitated for a second before signing, as if a part of her still wanted to fight, but there was no more war to be fought. In the end, when everything was sealed, she finally found the courage to ask. "Will you never want to see me again?" Daniel looked up at her for the first time in weeks. His expression was calm, but there was a weight in his voice. "Do you think I could?" She lowered her head, pressing the papers between her fingers. There was nothing more to say. He stood up, straightened his jacket and, without another word, left the room. And with that, he left his life forever. Time passed. Daniel moved to another apartment and gradually resumed his life. It wasn't easy, but every day away from that story was a step in the right direction. At some point, without realizing exactly when, he stopped thinking about Laura in pain. Her name stopped causing that suffocating feeling in your chest. He still carried scars, but they no longer hurt. And then, something unexpected happened. In a cafe, while distractedly drinking a coffee, he met someone. It was nothing planned, nothing was forced. The conversation flowed naturally, as if his life was finally allowing him to breathe again. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to smile, allowed himself to think about the possibility of starting over. Laura, on the other hand, never fully recovered. He lost respect at work, lost connections, lost everything he built. But more than anything else, she lost the only person who truly loved her. And this loss was a weight she would carry for the rest of her life. Betrayal always takes its toll. Now we want to know, what did you think of this story? What would you have done in the protagonist's place? Leave your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more impactful stories like this. We remind you that this channel does not support any type of betrayal. See you in the next story.